Hi everyone. Oh, my early. Hi everyone. It's for you, Facebook. My name is Tim Mackenzie, and it's really great to be able to welcome you to the first of the St. Michael's Spring Series lectures. I'm really looking forward to our time together tonight. I've only lived in 2 centuries, so I'm not that qualified to judge, but it seems to me that the 21st century is harder to live in than the 20th century. It seems to become more complex than it used to be. I suppose my parents used to look after me, and now they don't. Well, they still do, actually. But I kind of find things like kind of complicated and difficult. And you are intelligent people. You know how to navigate complexity. But even you might be feeling a little bit at the edge of what you can kind of make sense of the world with. And so in our spring series, we're unveiling some kind of ancient wisdom, some modern thoughts on some of the challenges that are facing the world today, and particularly on some of the things that perhaps seem to be difficult for Christians to think about in this modern world as well. Our first session tonight is with Dr. Philip Fountain. I pointed at the screen, that's not Dr. Philip Fountain. It's another gentleman whom you might have come across. And I guess he really brings into sharp focus for all of us really, but particularly for people in the church, that question about what is the relationship between religion and power. Jesus said something like, what would it profit a person if he or she gains the whole world, perhaps the whole of the United States, and loses his soul? Who knows? We shall find out, hopefully, in the course of this lecture. So, really great to have you here, and really looking forward to what Philip has to say. Philip is a senior lecturer at Victoria University. He has a master's degree in human geography from Victoria, and then a PhD from ANU, where he did a lot of work on the Mennonite Central Committee in Indonesia, and has subsequently worked in Singapore particularly, and is now back at Victoria's Religious Studies Department. I knew him when he was a budding actor. He and I acted together in some church dramas in about, well, probably was the last century, and we might yet see some of his dramatic flair tonight. So Phil, we're really stoked to have you here, and look forward to what you have to say. I was going to sit in this chair here and look like a TV host, and I think I'll feel stupid, so I'm
Thank you, Tim. Kia ora koutou, and welcome to the first talk in the St. Michael's Spring Series. The brief that I have been given in preparing for this talk was fairly broad, and naturally I have interpreted it in any way I saw fit. I understand that the spring thaw still needing to do some thawing, my job is to warm things up by firing the intellectual engines. The topic I have given myself to accomplish this purpose is to attempt to answer the question, why did so many Christians vote for Trump? I should tell you right at the outset that I don't intend to present to you a non-partisan, neutral, or objective interpretation of either Trump or his Christian supporters. I don't aspire to objectivity on these matters, and I would be suspicious of anyone who said they did. What I do aspire to is thinking a bit beyond the hot air, and around this topic there's a lot of it, in order to dig a little bit deeper, as it were. I should also tell you that I'm not going to address here the question of whether Trump should or should not be impeached, and nor will I address whether Trump legitimately won the 2016 presidential election, or whether it was hijacked by Russian hackers and the malicious machinations of Zuckerberg's social media empire. And here it is appropriate an appropriate moment for me to extend a warm welcome to all those watching on Facebook. These are all legitimate matters, of course, but they are not my focus tonight. What I do intend to talk about is some of the motivations, the logics, the beliefs held by Trump's Christian supporters. I will present my views on this over the next, give or take, 45 minutes, during which time I hope to give enough fodder for us to engage in some stimulating conversation after that. I am painfully aware of a number of really glaring absences in the talk which is coming up. And I'm also really aware of just how large the topic really is. So you'll need to forgive me in advance for missing out some crucial things, and I do hope that our conversation actually plies out a lot of those missing elements. We are also in St. Michael's, and although I'm someone trained in the social sciences, I am an anthropologist and I teach in religious studies at Victoria, I am also hoping to consider some of the theological dimensions of this topic. The subject of Christian support for Donald Trump in the 2016 American presidential elections and the extraordinary roller coaster ride of that presidency since then has intrigued and fascinated me ever since I was glued to the Republican primaries in the first half of 2016. It has also disturbed me. Trump is, patently I think, both amoral and immoral. He is amoral because he does not have any moral or ethical framework out of which he operates. Instead, what he has is an overwhelming desire to win. Trump believes in the art of the deal, the adulation of adoring fans, in the greatness of bigness and of the bigness of greatness. More than a few commentators have noted that Trump is a veritable avatar of Nietzschean passions for masculine power and strength. But this is not an ethical framework, nor a set of values. It is naked and unrestrained ambition, under which all values are subsumed. Trump has rightly been described as America's most secular president in decades, and not only because, prior to announcing his candidature, he hadn't darkened the door of a church for years. No, Trump is secular in the sense that his approach to life is not tethered to any particular religious ethic, but rather floats outside of any attempt to restrict his own self-actualization. While Trump appears to have no moral code of his own, he gleefully indulges in contravening the moral standards asserted by others. The porn star Stormy Daniels, or Stephanie Clifford, may or may not have had an extramarital affair with Trump, though, thanks to a confession of Trump's former lawyer, Michael Cohen, last week, we do now know that Trump paid her $130,000 to not talk about it. Whether or not Trump has sexually assaulted women, and we know of at least 15 women who have accused him of sexual harassment, he has boasted about having done so, including in the infamous Access Hollywood audio recording in which he bragged about his ability to kiss him and to grab him by their private parts because he is a star. I am not interested in Trump's sex life, but both of these incidents seem to me to be quite revealing for his approach to life in general. A spoiled child of bourgeois elites, Trump has always taken what he wants, whenever he wants it, and he has paid his lawyers to deal with the consequences. Narcissistic and self-obsessed world leaders are not, of course, an especially notable or abnormal thing. They seem to be fairly common. And I don't intend to spend very much time talking about Trump's manifold misdeeds tonight. What I am interested in, rather, are how Trump's Christian supporters navigate his glaringly apparent moral failings. Conservative American Christianity is renowned for its emphasis on moral purity, and no more so than on issues of sexuality. While you may not be especially keen on them, on their understandings of sexual morality, or morality in general, it is nevertheless striking the extent to which signature issues promoted by the American religious right for the last few decades, the pro-life movement, family values, opposing gay marriage, building personal character, and so on, are all drenched in an unabashed and unapologetic moralism. Surely Trump and his Christian voters are, therefore, strange and unusual bedfellows. I will argue that there are good reasons to think that this is indeed the case. There is something uncanny about this situation, and it spells danger for the future. But I will also argue that the connection is not merely arbitrary. There are logics, and there are reasons, as well as resonances, which make this situation at least somewhat understandable, even if it remains thoroughly problematic. The first issue we must deal with, however, is to identify something more about who these Christian Trump supporters are. To look at this, we must also look briefly at the broader field of American Christianity. This is because not all American Christians showed support for Donald Trump in the 2016 election. Far from it. Certain sections of the Christian population have been passionate supporters, yes. Others have been reluctant voters. And others have been extremely wary critics. This graph, which I hope is not too small for you at the back, this graph, compiled by the Pew Research Center, shows the religious composition of the United States in 2010 and the projection of what it might look like by 2050. There are a couple of observations I want to make. At nearly 80% of the population, in 2010, Christianity was the overwhelming religious majority in the United States. Why did Christians vote for Donald Trump? Well, there's a whole lot of them. While this is projected to decline somewhat over the next couple of decades, the dominance of Christianity looks set to continue, at least if you go with this, with 2/3 of Americans expected to identify as Christian in 2050. However, it is what the graph does not tell that is especially interesting to me. Christianity is here represented as a single monolithic block. But when it comes to theology and when it comes to politics, this is decidedly not the case. American Christianity is deeply fragmented, and this fragmentation cuts along deep political, geographic, cultural, and racial lines. A more nuanced analysis is required. I'll get to the statistics in just a moment, but to illustrate my point, American Christianity is diverse, and this diversity translates to support or otherwise for Trump. I want to start with the Reverend Dr. Howard John Wesley. In September last year, in front of his predominantly African-American congregation in historic Alfred Street Baptist Church, just outside of Washington, D.C., the Reverend Dr. Howard John Wesley preached a sermon on 1 Peter 5:8. This is his translation. Be sober. Be vigilant, which Howard John Wesley translates or glosses as stay woke. Be sober. Be vigilant. Because your adversary, the devil, walks about like a roaring lion, seeking whom he may devour. Resist him, steadfast in faith, knowing that your brothers and sisters are experiencing the same suffering. Over the course of his 40-minute-long masterclass in African-American preaching rhetoric, you can listen to the whole thing online if you want to Google it, Wesley explores the liberal usage of double entendre in 1 Peter. The roaring lion, that is the devil, is a king who sits on the throne, who devours the faithful, who disparages human rights, who persecutes the poor and the weak and the immigrant, and who is endlessly investigated for multifarious crimes but without impeachment. What are you going to do when evil sits on the throne? Asks Wesley. And you realize, along with his congregation, that the author of 1 Peter is not the only one adept in double entendre. Indeed, many Christians did vote for Trump in 2016 for reasons of distaste, policy, or having discerned in the man something... many Christians did not vote for Trump in 2016 for reasons of distaste, policy, or having discerned in the man something of the diabolical. Of those who did vote for Trump, exit polls and surveys have uncovered some interesting data, such as this graph, again from the Pew Research Center. The graph is based on a survey with just over 3,000 voters after the election. The key details as we move forward are this. Protestants voted for Trump 56% to Clinton 39%. But this fell profoundly along racial lines. 77% of white evangelicals voted Trump. 96% of black Protestants voted Clinton. Second point, Catholics represent a similar divide, with 52% for Trump and 44% for Clinton. But while 2/3 of white non-Hispanic Catholics voted for Trump, 80% of Hispanic Catholics voted Clinton. The statistic that has most frequently been taken up in media reports is that roughly 80% of evangelicals voted for Trump. However, as sociologist Samuel Perry has pointed out, the statement 80% of evangelicals voted for Trump is blatantly false. The evangelical category here includes only certain white, self-identified, evangelical or born-again Christians who actually voted in the election. Perry rightly notes that this is not synonymous with American evangelicalism as such. Perry points instead to a Baylor religion survey fielded in early 2017, which found that 52% of adults who claim affiliation with an evangelical denomination in the US did vote for Trump, with the other 48% voting for Clinton, that is about 24% voted for Clinton, or didn't vote, roughly 17%, or voted for someone else, roughly 7%, which is to say, roughly half of evangelicals in this survey voted for Trump, but the other half did not. What it is clear is that when it comes to voting patterns in the 2016 election, American Christianity is a house divided, if not at war, and that it is significantly more divided than we hear about it in the media. It is also clear that among other fissures, divisions take place along racial lines. I will return to this point soon, it's a key one. But before I do so, I want to think a bit more about the wider political ecosystem in which American elections take place. The ecosystem. A crucial feature of American presidential elections is that they tend to come down to just two viable options: a Republican candidate and a Democrat candidate. Of course, this barely passes the most basic test of what constitutes a working democracy. The difference between a one-party state and a two-party state is only one party. And this bifurcated decision-making process really does not constitute genuine political choice. This is especially the case given that both parties require vast sums of money in order to run their election campaigns, veritably ensuring that wealthy elites have disproportionate say in policy formation through their donations and lobbying activities. Regardless, what this political system does is that it presents voters with a stark choice. It is one or the other. And at this point, I want to stand briefly back and give a grateful nod towards New Zealand's own MMP system of preferential voting. We have a far from perfect system. But the party vote does open up a genuine political choice at elections between multiple contrasting visions of policies and indeed characters, individuals. A choice that is simply not available to Americans in their elections. In 2016, the other candidate was, of course, Hillary Rodham Clinton. Clinton was undeniably an extremely competent and capable, as well as deeply flawed candidate. She was also a woman, and I don't think this was insignificant for voting patterns. On the question of policy, Clinton fell on the wrong side of virtually every single issue that conservative American Protestants have come to regard as touchstone political concerns. on policy restricting access to abortion, defending family values, again, opposing homosexuality, advancing religious freedom, forgive the scare quotes again, backing the state of Israel, and getting conservative judges nominated to the Supreme Court, Trump consistently sounded the bright notes to conservative Protestants, whereas Clinton consistently alienated the same voters. Regardless of what you personally think about these policy issues and how they align or otherwise with Christian morality, I certainly find it disconcerting how much of that moral agenda of the religious right centers on what I'll call below-the-belt issues of sex and sexuality. It is entirely conceivable that those who regard these issues as definitive policy matters would regard Trump's policies as more aligned with their interests than those of Clinton. In a stark either-or choice, including when you think that both candidates are deeply flawed, it is understandable that some conservative Protestants chose Trump. It is important to realize that this set of policy interests didn't come out of nowhere. The long history of cultivating an affiliation, that's my image, between this particular set of policy issues and the Republican Party stretches back at least to the 1980s with the likes of Jerry Falwell and his moral majority movement creating a broad political movement on the religious right. Falwell sought to counteract a sense shared among many conservative Protestants and fundamentalists that they had undergone an extended period of political exile. Falwell and others sought to initiate a political resurgence, and over the following years, they built a powerful set of Christian organizations and considerable momentum behind their list of moral concerns. What emerged was a well-defined political lobby for a select list of identified political projects. What also emerged was a growing alignment between one particular party, the Republicans, and this group of lobbyists. Given this history, it is not surprising that voting behavior at the 2016 election was quite similar to voting patterns over preceding elections. There is a large block of conservative Protestant voters who vote consistently Republican, irrespective of the particular candidate being stood. Many conservative Protestants have a significant ideological affinity for the Republican Party. Republicans have, since at least the 1980s, stood for small government when it comes to economic matters such as taxation. But they have promoted a strongly interventionary big government when it comes to what are regarded as moral issues, the military and the justice system. As David Barr from the University of Chicago has argued in a fascinating piece published recently and online in the Religion and Culture Forum, seeing this combination of economic libertarianism and strict moral regulation as deeply conflicted doesn't mean it is entirely illogical. And in any case, the question of coherence is largely irrelevant when it comes to voting patterns. The fact is that there is a long-standing affinity between conservative Protestants and the Republican Party, including now that the Republicans are under Trump. So some, perhaps many, Christian voters decided to cast their vote for Trump for reasons connected with advancing their own political interests. Having identified these interests, these voters sought to elect the candidate which most closely aligned with their preferred policies. Did Trump deliver? Dang right he did. There is very clear evidence that on matters of moral concern and other political concerns, Trump has gone out of his way to please his conservative Protestant backers. A few examples. Trump's choice of Mike Pence as vice president was a clear signal to conservative Protestants that they would have their man centrally located to the workings of power. Pence was well known among evangelical lobbyists. After assuming the White House in January 2017, among Trump's first actions was the implementation of the Mexico City policy, which barred international NGOs that perform or promote abortions from receiving US government funding, a deeply symbolic nod toward the anti-abortion lobby. Trump nominated Neil Gorsuch and Brett Kavanaugh to the Supreme Court. Both candidates are seen as promoting conservative Protestant interests. In the lead up to the election, Trump drew up a list of potential Supreme Court candidates that was tailor-made to court conservative Protestant and Catholic political preferences. In May this year, Trump moved the US embassy in Israel to Jerusalem, a move that was greeted with celebration among conservative Protestants who share a strongly Zionist bent. Also in May this year, Trump expanded and relaunched the Faith-Based Initiative, which facilitates religious groups' access to federal financial support to deliver social services. Trump has promoted a series of evangelical concerns via his preferred medium of Twitter, including arguing that Christian prayer should be conducted again in public schools. Trump's handlers have clearly been adept at managing signals to those who have the eyes to see them. Indeed, Trump is portrayed as the strong man that white evangelicals desired to overcome their years in exile. He is their candidate, and he actively seeks to promote their interests. Conservative Protestants voted for the things they valued, and it seems to me they largely got what they wanted. Even with these policy wins, there is still the rather awkward issue of Trump's glaring personal moral failings. But Trump hasn't had to counteract these questions on his own. He has a whole coterie of pastors, what historian John Fee derisively calls court evangelicals, who have willingly done this job for him. Ever since Trump won the Republican primaries, a group of Christian pastors have actively sought to sacralize and Christianize Trump. You might have thought that such a feat would be a minor miracle to pull off, given the shape of the raw materials they were working with. But it is amazing what can be accomplished when you have no moral scruples. In many instances, the rhetorical baptism of Donald Trump has been an utterly shameless and hypocritical fawning over the president by Christian leaders who have proved themselves entirely willing to indulge in lies and half-truths as techniques to accomplish their own naked political ambitions. Trump is what he is, and indeed, he has remarkably little depth or subtlety. But these religious leaders had the audacity and gall to render Trump into a veritable messiah. A few examples will suffice. James Dobson, from Focus on the Family, once argued that Bill Clinton's escapades with Monica Lewinsky made him unfit for political office. But he suddenly, and quite remarkably, lost all such scruples when it came to Trump, a figure he had thrown his considerable weight behind. Paula White, the lead pastor at New Destiny Christian Center in Florida and a tele-preacher with a major publishing empire to boot, told her followers that she was responsible for leading Trump to accept Jesus Christ as his personal Lord and Savior. She told her many followers that she believed 100% that Trump was now a bona fide Christian. Jerry Falwell Jr., the son of the leader of the moral majority in the 1980s, has repeatedly backed and supported Trump, including by inviting him to speak at Liberty University, the institution which Falwell leads. Falwell declared that Trump's personal life had dramatically changed since he became a born-again Christian. Robert Jeffress, an American Southern Baptist pastor, goes beyond many of the other court evangelicals in arguing that it is precisely Trump's lack of Christian scruples that makes him such a great president. Here's a quote. "I don't care about that candidate's tone or vocabulary. I want the meanest, toughest son of a you-know-what I can find. And," he adds, "I believe that's biblical." The effect of these, quite frankly, morally bankrupt and theologically dubious efforts has been to render a pathological liar and serial playboy into a figure that conservative Protestants could find palatable. this sacralization is rightly considered a deep betrayal of their own moral discourse in a flagrant pursuit of access to political power. It has, however, been an entirely effective strategy, at least insofar as court evangelicals have been rewarded for their shame. And thirdly, it can be seen as a consequence of a concerted and shameless, but highly effective, efforts to sacralize Trump by a prominent group of power-craving court evangelicals. It is now time to return back to questions of whiteness, of the whiteness of Trump's evangelical backers. It is my contention that this issue is crucial for an effective understanding, effective evaluation of Trump's appeal. In a recent article published in the American Journal of Cultural Sociology, Yale sociologist Philip Gorski argues that a primary reason why white evangelicals voted for Donald Trump is that they are also white Christian nationalists. And that, quote, Trumpism is inter alia a reactionary version of white Christian nationalism. For Gorski, white Christian nationalism, he gives it the acronym WCN, has long celebrated a rhetoric of blood, which has sacrificial, apocalyptic, and racial dimensions. Trump has played all three tunes, and his rhetoric therefore resonates deeply with a community that has profound nostalgia for a glorious white American past. Here's Gorski. Traditionally, WCN's preferred racial and religious others were blacks, Catholics, and Jews. In Trumpism, they have been partly displaced by Mexicans and Muslims. Trump consistently portrays these others as threatening and polluting. The solution, it follows, is purification and separation. That's the end of the quote. Gorski's article was published in July 2017, just a few weeks prior to the notorious Charlottesville Unite the Right rally in Virginia. The rally brought together white supremacists, neo-fascists, Klansmen, and neo-Nazis in a rally for their cause. The protesters shouted anti-Semitic slogans, and they were adorned with swastikas and Nazi symbols. In response, counter-protesters gathered and engaged in a vociferous action against the rally. In the midst of the mayhem, James Alex Fields, a 20-year-old white supremacist, drove his sedan straight into the crowd of counter-protesters, hitting several and killing Heather Heyer. In his response, Trump famously refused to condemn white supremacism and instead argued that there was hatred, bigotry, and violence on many sides, and that all sides had great people on them. In the light of such comments, I think Gorski's suggestion that anti-black racism has been partly displaced is a mistake. While the racist agenda of white supremacists and white Christian nationalists among them has been expanded to include new others, the old others remain all too readily available as targets of hatred and bigotry. Pardon me. Political scientist Benjamin Leonard has rightly argued that white Christian nationalism is simply, here's a quote, factional self-interest posturing as gospel imperative. The promotion of white interests as recalling a Christian heritage is an attempt to bathe their cause in a Christian light so that it has the appearance of being something other than the crass and vulgar bigotry it is. Noting that this involves a remarkable reconfiguration of the message of love and reconciliation that lies at the heart of Orthodox Christian theology is not an attempt to excuse the involvement of American Christianity in deep histories of racial violence. It is, however, an attempt to suggest that racist violence and white supremacy is unambiguously heterodox, and to state otherwise is, I believe, a profound moral and theological error. It is here that I have a note in my margins. It says hate, anger, despair, and scapegoating. And I think I'm going to leave that note just there, with only just the briefest of glosses. It's all fine and good to note that white supremacy lies at the heart of many of Trump's voters. The question, however, is how white supremacy came to play such a major role within what we're calling white Christian nationalism. And I think you can't provide an analysis of that without engaging in questions of hate, anger, despair, and scapegoating. Thanks, Hayden. Cheers, man. Following Gorski's and Linard's line of argument, it is apparent that when white American evangelicals talk positively about Trump as their president, who holds back the forces of darkness and who fulfills a messianic task of making America great again, they are actually deploying a deeply racialized rhetoric of white supremacy. You can certainly see why someone like the Reverend Dr. Howard John Wesley from Alfred Street Baptist Church would regard Trump as diabolical, a roaring lion who sits on the throne and threatens to devour you. When white folks talk about making America great again, such statements should be read as code for returning America to black slavery, Jim Crow, burning crosses, and vigilante lynchings. Let me draw this talk to a close with some final thoughts. Electoral politics is inherently a matter of strategic compromise. A number of American evangelicals have clearly decided that they are willing to overlook what may be a distaste for Trump's personal immorality or amorality in order to ensure that their policy ambitions are advanced. If it was simply a question of whether Trump did or did not sleep with a porn actress while his wife was pregnant with their son, I think I could understand, probably, the logic at work. After all, I do not require or expect my politicians to be morally perfect. And nor do I cast my vote on the basis of whether any particular politician is Christian or otherwise. What matters most is policy and political impact. But Trump's political impact has been disastrous, both domestically in the US and internationally. Trump's racist and sexist rhetoric, his pathological lying, his abusive vindictiveness, and his mean-hearted bullying have legitimated and empowered highly destructive elements within global political discourse. We are all the losers. This uncivil term was ushered in by white Christians who continued to facilitate and enable it. To use Trump's own preferred pejorative terms, this situation is both bad and sad. It ought to be lamented with sackcloth and ashes. The time is now ripe, I think, to rethink the political project of American evangelicalism. Forgive the image. Some will interpret the current tragedy of American evangelical politics as yet another definitive nail in the coffin of religious politics as such. Religion and politics are like oil and water, aren't they? And the two should never mix. I disagree. After all, Christianity is inherently political, and politics is inherently concerned with questions of ethics and morality. Rather than insist on an implausible separation, the question is rather what kind of political engagements constitute a Christian politics rightly considered. One of the deep problems that has characterized the American religious right is its craving for coercive power. If only we controlled the Supreme Court, we could overturn Roe versus Wade. If we have our guy in the Oval Office, we'll finally be able to make America Christian again, and so on. The political theology characteristic of court evangelicals is thoroughly Constantinian. It has assumed that the goal is to achieve dominance and gain power. This political theology is flawed. I have 4 concluding points. First, American evangelical political theology vastly underestimates the corrupting and intoxicating effects of power. This is a catastrophic moral and theological mistake. Second, American evangelical political theology has failed to acknowledge that a bona fide Christian politics is always concerned as much with how it is done as it is with any other outcome. It is indeed good for nothing if you successfully gain the White House but lose your soul in the process. Third, American evangelical political theology has failed to adequately differentiate between America and God. White Christian nationalism is properly understood within the terms of Christian theology as idolatry. It takes an object that is not God and worships it instead. Fourth, American evangelical political theology has for too long misconstrued politics as being primarily a matter of governance and regulation. But Christian politics neither begins nor ends with the state. For Christian ethicists, Stanley Hauerwas and Jonathan Trum, quote, once Christians zero in on the state as a locus of political activity, they become blind to those myriad other ways the church might politically act in the broad horizon of democratic possibility. End of quote, and amen. It is therefore time to throw wide open the political doors, to rethink again what a Christian politics, the politics of love, of grace, and of hope, might look and sound like. One thing I am sure of, such politics will sound nothing like Donald Trump. Thank you.
That's cool. Thanks, Phil. A lot to think about there. Yeah, I have nothing to say. We could, if you just look out and refill your glass, we're going to get stuck into questions. We've got about 20 minutes or thereabouts for some questions from the floor. Please try to make these questions and not too much political commentary. And I wonder if we have any starters for 10. So.
I wonder how much has to do with the foundation of the Southern Baptist Convention in white slavery, plantation ownership, the Civil War. The other thing too is the connection between between Christian purity culture and rape culture, which perhaps has a bit to do with the connection between so-called family values and Donald Trump.
Two questions there with us.
First one with the Southern Baptist Convention and histories of slavery in the American South. My initial inclination is really historical, and my first attempt to go about preparing this lecture was to begin to narrate history right from the revolution in the US on. However, having read this book, I realized there was no point in my doing so, because I could basically point you to this and say, read it, it's a good book, and it does that. John Fee is a professor of history at Messiah College, a conservative Christian evangelical institution in rural Pennsylvania. And the book is, Believe Me, The Evangelical Road to Donald Trump. And it does that, as only a master historian could. It narrates that history of American evangelicalism down to three narratives, as he has it. They are the narrative of power, and I've particularly emphasized that, the desire to be in power. But there's also a narrative of fear. And Fee locates fear right at the center of American politics, American evangelical politics, right from the outset. It's also a narrative of power, of fear. There's one other. Curses. I can't remember. And he does it very well. Certainly, this is a story of American race relations, utterly, through and through. It is a story of a civil rights movement which has not attained its goal, You can change law, but that's not the same thing as changing hearts. And those racial divides in the United States remain deep and scarring, absolutely. On the Southern Baptist Convention, however, the Southern Baptist Convention has recently elected a new president, not of the country, of their Southern Baptist Convention, and that person's campaign speech was absolutely a repudiation of the ways in which the Southern Baptist Convention has supported and backed Donald Trump, and an absolute repudiation of white supremacist politics and theology, and a strong and stinging critique on the sexism also, which has characterized parts of that fault. And I think that those movements, though we never hear about them in the New Zealand media, are actually really significant. And they talk about the ways in which this war is far from over, including in the heartlands of what we imagine have voted for Donald Trump. I don't actually have anything particularly to say on rape culture, I'm afraid. There are strong sexist elements and dimensions that overlap absolutely with white Christian nationalism. This is something to mourn and lament, but beyond that, I don't have much to contribute. I'm sorry.
I read an article from an American publication where a pastor said that it's not fair. I have my congregation for 1 hour a week. Fox News hasn't for the rest of the week. I want to ask you your commentary on the divisiveness of American media as a reflection of divisiveness of American culture.
I think that's a very astute commentary, actually. I think pastors of many types tend to overestimate how important anyone else thinks they are. And that includes if they're lucky to have an hour of talking on a Sunday morning. I think also there has been a kind of failure of the intellectual and theological imagination over how it is that minds and hearts are shaped and formed. I think, as we've had tonight, a fairly long lecture, my own feeling about lectures is that they do very, very limited impact on helping shape our minds, imaginations, and values. There can be a starting point, and at best, a sermon or a lecture is only that, a starting point for an ongoing conversation. But I would locate the ways in which we actually shape our political and theological imaginations in very different spaces than church, and very different spaces from lecture halls. And Fox News is a significant part of the American scene. I have Mennonite pastor friends who have argued that, who've talked about their own congregations in rural Pennsylvania and have said, you've got two types of Mennonites, they've said. You've got the Fox News Mennonites, and then you've got the National Public Radio Mennonites. And that division runs straight down my congregation, they've said. And the ways in which those media sources go about shaping our imaginations is thoroughly significant. However, probably diminishing in significance. We now have the capacity to create almost completely insular bubbles in which we only hear ourselves echoed back and forth through social media. And those bubbles are now really displacing satellite networks like Fox News in far-reaching ways. I think that this increasing absence of an acceptable and accepted public conversation is a tragedy, and a tragedy for national politics in New Zealand as well as elsewhere, and a real challenge. How do you have a conversation with people you don't agree with? And what we're facing at the moment is a collapse of the ability to have those conversations. We need to figure out ways how to talk again. Absolutely.
You mentioned the importance of the small state economically. I'm wondering how important you think that it is in a lot of Trump supporters' minds that he's a rich man. You know, have you got to be rich to be seen to be vote-worthy in the States? This is the way, but not necessarily the way, the truth, or the light.
I think Trump inadvertently is probably a bit of a political mastermind in his deployment of rhetoric. On the one hand, he is utterly a bourgeois elite, and he flaunts that in kind of shameless ways. And that flaunting is this portrayal of someone who is bigger, better, a winner, true winner, and therefore everyone else should support him and back him because he knows how to win. And there is that side of it. There's been some fabulous journalistic pieces written about the ways Trump flew in on his enormous jet to different political rallies around the country, and hushed crowds would say, "That's a big plane." And of course that bigness of the plane, the bigness of Donald Trump's wealth, was a significant part of his appeal. But on the other hand, and it's a juxtaposition of this, he railed against Eastern elites. He railed against the kind of academic and scholarly intellectual elitism. And his rhetoric is among the most basic of any American politician in living memory. His actual vocabulary use is extraordinarily limited, and his language is often, it's about bad, and it's about sad, and it's about big, and that's about the extent of his descriptive words. And that deployment of this kind of everyday speak, I think the word every man speak resonates with the gender issues at stake. It is a really significant part of his appeal. So it's both the bigness of his plane and the bad, sad, and big, all in one. Yeah.
Yeah, I was just going to say, the thing you said about the mention of rape culture is a very sort of specific phenomenon, but just more sort of generally in terms of sexism and male supremacy, anti-feminism. You could say that the Trump campaign and the success has been, would you agree, built on and allowed by a particular sort of American misogyny. Countries have their different problems. There's a particular sort of American misogyny and anti-feminism. Would you agree? And Trump's tapped into that?
Yes. But it's such a big country, and it's so diverse. Many of leading feminists, it's not coincidental that they've worked, they've lived, they've flourished in the United States. A strong and powerful liberatory political agenda has been cultivated and enabled within that context in ways that it has not in many other places. And yet, simultaneously, clearly Trump is an ubermensch who appeals to those who like such things. And I think that that's certainly a very important part of his appeal. Again, for me, the questions and the itches that I would want to scratch is how this is facilitated, enabled, and produced within Christian discourses and practices. That's where I would be inclined to go and ferret out. And I warrant that on both sides of that particular gender line. You have Christianity and Christian communities right there at the forefront of each.
So I was recently in Houston, and I was interested in why people were voting for Trump. And my husband and I met a couple of people, and we said, why did you vote for this man? And clearly, they were talking great things about Trump. They said, oh, he's a great family man. And what I'm struggling with is the ability of people to really believe those things, and it's not only those people in Houston, it's other people we've talked to at home as well. How can they believe he's a great family man, they're good Christians, and still vote for him, knowing what we know now and what everyone knows about storming demons, etc.?
I think our capacity for self-deception is much greater than we'd like to imagine. I think that your story is extraordinary, and all the more so because it's actually quite normal. Numerous commentators have noted that those sorts of discourses. And I think probably beyond saying yes again, probably the point to be made is that maybe we too have those capacities for self-deception. And there is this chance here looking at others to perhaps look in the mirror and wonder, well, to what extent do I re-manipulate my interests so that they suit me? To what extent is it something that I want it to be true, and therefore it is? And that kind of, that question is a bit more haunting, I think, than simply noting the hypocrisy of others. It begins to wonder, to what extent am I implicated?
Thanks for your talk. At the same time that these things have been happening with Trump, some of the things have been happening internationally, with Hungary, Poland, Brexit, and so on and so forth, often in relation to immigration and other factors. Your analysis has clarified a lot of things specific to America, or might be specific to America, like evangelicals that have done this. I guess it's not quite your topic, but given that there are international similarities, how does that bear on this kind of issue or analysis?
I think that's an outstanding question. It's a very difficult one. Let me try and answer. Part of it is that footnote I left to one side. Fear, anger, hate, scapegoating, and therefore economics. My reading is that for large parts of the last 70, 80 years, the global economy has seen an unprecedented rise. That economic growth has facilitated all sorts of political and ethical outcomes. Among them has been the capacity to believe that things are getting better. This capacity is an extraordinary feature of that post-war period. You wanted, in the American context, the American dream. You wanted your children to have an education that you didn't have, and they could have it. You wanted your children to have a bigger house than you ever imagined, and then they did. But in the 1980s, that began grinding to the halt in the US, and not just in the US. We've seen stagnant incomes in the United Kingdom for decades. The US has had stagnant incomes for decades. New Zealand's inequality is enormous and growing. We're seeing profound effects as a consequence of a globe which will not face continuous economic growth. This is not necessarily to be known on an intellectual level, it's known on a guttural level. We face extraordinary new challenges as a consequence of human-induced climate change, whether you want to acknowledge it or not. Those impacts are already being felt, and they're being felt very deeply. This leads directly into questions of hope or despair. I think in the American context, there are a whole range of reasons for the current opioid addiction crisis in the United States. Last year, around about 72,000 people died as a consequence of an overdose in the US alone. Of the many reasons for why the US might have an opioid crisis, I would put despair and the kind of resonance which someone like Lauren Southern had in New Zealand shocked me, but maybe it shouldn't. In fact, New Zealand is just as prone to those sort of scapegoating, pain, despair, then that becomes this really haunting one. Is hope that our economies will get going again? Is hope to be located elsewhere? And how is it to be communicated, inculcated, and felt at a guttural, existential level? I think we are now moving into a much more dangerous time. And I think learning how to navigate this will be an enormous challenge. Whether we have politicians and leaders who are up for it is a genuine question.
That felt to me almost like a concluding statement, I have to say.
Okay.
Phil's, I'm sure, happy to stick around and answer more questions and things, but I think that's probably not a bad point to end on. I was reading last night a comment on the architect of the Anglican Church, Thomas Cranmer, on his kind of, it's the sort of thing vicars do, on his kind of psychology, his view of psychology, and the quote was, the heart, what the heart loves, the will chooses, and the mind justifies. But it begins with the heart, what we allow ourselves to love and how we allow our loves to be shaped, that then determines what we do. And I think a lot of what you said is quite resonant for that and really sort of catalyses all of us, I guess, whatever our religious viewpoints, to think really carefully about how our loves are shaped and when we allow our affections and our desires to go. And it's a cautionary tale. Thanks very much, Phil. He mentioned in the second last question, or the last one, the question about economics. And our next talk in the spring series is in fact about economics and the global financial crisis. It's 2 weeks tonight. Associate Professor Ben Thurkel-White will talk about the kind of aftermath of the global financial crisis and what it has or hasn't done to kind of shape the global economic system. So look forward to seeing you all back for that event. But first, let's give Phil a massive round of applause before we do.